Hi, it's Melody Lauer from Citizens Defense Research, and I'm sitting here with Ross. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the entire idea of consent, how consent kind of works with criminal behavior, and we're just going to dive right in. So, Ross, why don't you go ahead and start out by telling us what you do and why you're kind of the perfect person to talk about something like this?
Well, I'm going to give you the short version. I think it all comes down to I'm an analyst of human behavior is really what I do and what I've done for a couple decades now for the government. And what that means is I work with a lot of convicted felons and violent convicted felons post release and trying to predict if they're going to reoffend, doing lots of face to face interviews, following them, searching them, doing stuff like that. And now I work full time with sex offenders for the last 5 to 6 years now. So that's my area of expertise is figuring out what they're thinking, how they predate, and trying to keep them from doing it again.
Which is, I mean, you and I have talked about this offline, just the amount of, I guess, criminal behavior and clandestine criminal behavior that you must be um, not subjected to, because that makes it sound almost like you're a victim to, but just exposed to from the perspective of watching this and watching these things fold out is super interesting. And and this is how we kind of got into this conversation was you and I have had extensive conversations around consent, particularly when we were kind of working up for our personal protection for women class. So I guess in a nutshell, how would there's like legal definition of consent, and then there's kind of like colloquial definition of consent. How would you define it?
Oh boy. And to preface this, I'm not a mental health uh, professional by any means. I've just witnessed thousands and thousands of car accidents at this point. So I'm pretty good at kind of seeing some of those patterns, but that's kind of where I'm coming at it from. Um, so consent is tricky in that we almost always, without thinking, use a very legal definition of consent. So if you look at any university's orientation program for new students, they all nowadays have a class on consent or a section on consent, and it is always very very black and white. It is if it is not clear cut, yes, all the time and every 5 seconds, and anytime anyone asks, and they're not inebriated, and they're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all these things, then it's not consent. It has to be all of those things, and that's great if you're trying to figure out a verdict, on a sex offense or rape after the fact, because then it makes it pretty straightforward. The downside is that that's not, and this is backed up by a few different studies, but the big one that you and I are aware of, have talked about before, is the SHIFT study out of Columbia University. Um, but there are others. People don't work that way, right? When we're trying to figure out what we want out of a relationship, it's messy, right? Very rarely, I mean, think about it. How many times have you walked into a relationship and just on date one laid everything out? Here's what I like. Here's what I don't like. This is what I want. This is what I don't want. Here in excruciating detail. And even if you are that person, great. There are a few of those around. Did you do that when you were 16 or 18 or 13? Pretty rare, right? So it's messier than that legal definition.
Yeah, and when I was an EMT, there's also so when you when you think of like the spectrum of consent, what we're talking about is kind of consent in relationships. There's consent, what's called assumed consent. Like as an EMT, if I come across someone who's unconscious, it's assumed that you want me to save you. So that's assumed consent. And then there's express consent, right? Which is what you're kind of talking about, that I asked you a question like, do you consent to this? And you say, yes, I do. Then of course, and that can be wrapped up into like legal documentation, right? If I sign a document, then I'm consenting to buy the thing or whatever. And then we're kind of talking about express consent. Then there's also implied consent, which is through body language or through gesturing. If I'm standing at my front door and I go, like I don't actually say, please come into my house, but I stand there and I smile at you and I wave at you and you walk in my door, you could say, hey, that was implied consent there. So there's all these different, you know, avenues, and then we get into how we can break basically consent, right? You know, we can break consent by just completely ignoring what somebody tells us, which at that point is a crime, right? Like if you tell me no, like if I say, can I have $10? And you're like, no, you can't have $10. But then I take your wallet from you and get your money out of it. That's called theft, and or burglary or
Right.
robbery, depending on, you know, the circumstancing around
Where
it.
you're at.
But what we're kind of talking about is excuse me, is that gray area of when does kind of assume, not necessarily assumed, because assumed consent kind of goes towards like medical professionals and stuff like that. But when does
I'd say
maybe
nonverbal,
yeah, like maybe implied consent
right?
goes towards, okay, we're in this gray area of negotiating for consent. Let's start there. Like when someone cannot consent.
Well, I'll go with the easy one, which is when they're unconscious. That's pretty hard. But that's a spectrum as well, right? Because there is a large swath of consciousness between fully caffeinated and aware of your surroundings and what's going on and giving consent, and a couple beers deep, and then further on down that spectrum. And so, at what point does that become problematic? And that's a very, very tough question to answer. And really what we have as a legal system, as a country, have decided largely is that it depends, and it depends
Mm-hmm.
on the people involved and what they considered those boundaries to be. And to dovetail off of what you were saying earlier of how complex nonverbal consent can be, and just to clear it up, that is by far in all of these studies the majority of consent is nonverbal. And it is, if you think about it, going on dates for most people, right? It's nonverbal. It can get so convoluted as to be by proxy. So if you just show up to a certain party that everybody knows is a certain party, it is very easy for everyone at that party to just assume you must know what you're there to do, whatever that may be, whether that's drink, do drugs, or whatever, watch the Super Bowl, or do something more interesting, right? And so that can get really complex really fast. And so in the end, I think I think it comes down to the people involved. And I think that discussion is something that people should be having with themselves, right? And with their loved ones as early and often as possible. And I think leaving it up to kind of the official, the schools and the official programs that are out there talking about consent is short-sighted, because they're only going to talk about basically verbal consent and then construe that that's the only thing that exists is verbal consent and everything else is non-consensual. Um, and again, those studies don't back that up. The Shift study, one of the more fascinating parts of that was interviewing people who had been on both sides of an uncomfortable sexual situation, where they were both freshmen, they were both trying to figure out sex for the first time. They both consented, they both met up to make out and have sex, and then they had some weird feelings about it afterwards. And female had basically related that, so the uh, she thought that by pulling away or by acting uncomfortable, that was giving the signal of, hey, this is kind of uncomfortable for me. It's not that I don't consent to this per se, we're not quite there yet, but we're close, right? We're getting there on that spectrum. And the male half had interpreted that as, I'm not doing it good enough, I need to try harder.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a recipe for disaster right there. If you have two people who have very different versions of expressing consent coming together for something like that. And then when we bring in a third party like a university or some structure that's responsible for all those people's safety, and they have their
Mm-hmm.
needs and legal requirements on top of everybody else's
Yeah.
feelings about it, holy shit, does it get complicated in a hurry. And it gets into a point where it's like, you know, and we have these conversations all the time on my end where people have, and the sex offender will always be the one to be playing that side and being like, well, you know, it wasn't really that thing. And that muddies the waters because then it makes, from a legal standpoint, you almost have to just assume the worst no matter what the person's
Mhm.
saying. And then you get situations like what we have where everything's rape and there's no room for any gray experimentation on anybody's part. And like that shift study talked about, all that does is make people less likely to define what happened to them as rape, which, okay, is that a win? I don't know.
Yeah. And
Maybe,
it's like,
maybe not.
what side do we what side do we err on, right? So do we err on the
Right.
side of believing, and taking every claim seriously, which I think we should take every claim seriously, yes, but
Right.
prosecuting everything and potentially ruining the life of someone who is not a predator in favor of making
Yeah.
sure that people, or do we err on the side of, I mean, we have a culture of innocent until proven guilty, but in this one
Right.
area, we do have a bit more of a guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes guilty forever,
But
just because the claim was made.
yep.
And
And it's
man,
tough
that
because
becomes
the other side of that,
so hard.
yeah, the other
And
side of that coin though is that, you know, how long does it take the victim? How many times did the victim have to tell somebody before they were believed?
yeah,
And just from my stats, you know, years usually.
mhm,
And so, and I read that all the time, right? With
yeah,
kids, especially kid told mom. And a lot of people think their reaction when I tell them that is, well, how could that be? I would never do that to my kid if my kid told me. And what I tell them to think is, okay, but that's, you haven't experienced it yet. What I want you to do is imagine someone in your life who you entrust implicitly, your
mhm,
dad, your mom, your husband, someone, your kid, whoever it is, just that you trust implicitly. And imagine someone coming up to you, a stranger, walking up to you and saying, that person sexually assaulted me yesterday. How would you feel about it? Of
yeah,
course, your brain would be doing the same thing we've been talking about, going, this can't be, there must be a
mhm,
mistake. Maybe there's something I don't know. I need to hear about what happened. The last thing you're going to initially do for most people is run and call 911 right away on your loved one with no further
mhm,
information. Just be like, yep, 100%. Let's lock them up. And so the problem is now there's a little bit of a, we're again, we don't like awkward situations socially. We're sort of built to look away, to dehumanize, to find outs for ourselves that make that comfortable. And it doesn't take a lot of those to suddenly end up in talking that victim, especially if they're a kid, out of what they're telling you and putting that doubt because they listen to adults and
yeah,
putting that doubt in their mind. And so that's the other side of the coin. And so, yeah, both of those things are true. And it is a mess. And that's why I still have a job. And we're still going to be doing this 50, 100, probably 1,000 years from now, because it's, it's competing values of being a human. And boy, is it tough. And it can be very complex because you could have people who showed up to something that was consensual and they thought they wanted it and they knew all the parts and checked the boxes and even may have said yes and verbally explicit about it, and then halfway through it wasn't. And how do you
mhm,
then express that? Because it's one thing to just say, hey, just say you're uncomfortable. Well, okay, that's awkward, right? In the middle of sex to just say, eh. And I know adults that can't do that, let
oh
alone
yeah, for sure,
young people who've never had to do that before. That's a learned
yeah.
skill.
Well, and I came across this acronym while I was kind of prepping to talk about this, and I liked it. I loved it and I hated it at the same time, right? So the acronym was FRIES, and this was it. And it was consent should be freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. So I like it, right? Like that sounds good. But that being said, there's so many things that could start out, like you said, enthusiastic, and then all of a sudden maybe the enthusiasm goes down, but why is the enthusiasm going down? And we're talking about long-term consequences. We can get into some really dangerous territory if you were raised to think that if someone is not enthusiastic, that maybe it's not that they're saying no, but that they are, that's kind of the clue that maybe you need to try a little bit harder. Um, like you said, that could get you in really big trouble really fast. How do we start to address that with people, especially young kids?
Oh man. Um, that's not an easy answer, but I'll give you, I grew up in a family that was very nonverbal. Like we're very English. My dad is a naturalized citizen, and so he comes by it naturally there. But like you don't say what you're thinking, right?
Mhm.
You do everything but that. And you talk around it and let the other person figure it out from context clues. And that's great, except when it comes to stuff like this, because then you're questioning everything that's going on, and you're not giving clear answers all the time, because you just don't do that. That's awkward. And so I think one big step right there is identifying people, and people identifying themselves who grew up in that culture, and realizing that there is another way to do it. And it sucks for you because it's going to be awkward, it's going to be uncomfortable. But one of the best things you can do is start to get used to that and being a little bit more expressive about yourself. um, and there's a bunch of ways to do that, right? But starting to talk about it with other people is a big one. In my field, we have to talk in excruciating detail about sex and some really rough topics, and I mean excruciating levels of detail, frequently, because we have to sit through therapy with these guys, listen to what they're thinking, listening. There's such a thing as a masturbation log, which is what they're thinking about when they do that. And we have to read those and think. So that's the level we're at. So to say that I have gotten over some of that is an understatement, but it's because of my job, and not everybody's going to get to do that. Now I could talk about sex all day long, and I don't blush or anything. I'm just like, yep, you know, and but that's a rare thing in the
Mhm.
US, even today, as much
Especially,
as
yeah.
we, yeah.
Well,
And so,
especially with
well, and
like
so,
purity
good.
cultures, right? And people who
Yeah,
are very shameful, like sex is a taboo
yeah,
topic. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about what's good about it. We don't talk about what's, potentially bad about it. Um, and we don't really give, at least I was raised like, we don't give kids permission to be like, hey, especially girls. It's getting better, but we don't give girls
yeah,
or boys permission to be like, hey, there's going to be things that you are going to love. And there's going to be things that
yep,
you're maybe not going to, and you're just going to have to try out and figure out what you like and what you don't. Wow. How many
yep,
parents? I mean, I'm sure there's more now than there were, but I mean, how many parents have that
sure.
conversation with their kids? Like,
It's
it's going to
it's
be great. Try
yeah,
it
it's
out.
uncomfortable, right? And,
Funny.
and to that note, like we we sell ourselves short a lot of times when we're not having those explicit conversations, because for whatever reason, I get it, some people aren't comfortable doing that. Okay, find someone who is, because um there's always correlations back to sex offenses, and I don't want to over exaggerate and say that this tiny little thing is means a sex offense is happening.
Mhm.
But to put it in perspective, one of the things we have to fight against with sex offenders all the time in their mental state is that they they so one of the warning signs is teaching kids words that aren't explicitly vagina, penis, things like that,
Mhm.
calling them little pet names, right? My hoo ha or something like that. And that doesn't necessarily mean a sex offense is happening, but it does mean that you're uncomfortable talking about it, and you're trying to dehumanize it a little bit and start to take it away from what it actually is. And um, again, just to put it in perspective, that can be one of the paths towards a sex offense. If someone is grooming a kid, is starting to use that language to again take it away from the act itself, just a little bit. And so we're not doing ourselves any favors by doing that stuff, even though it is comfortable. And I just think that as uncomfortable as it is, we just have to, as adults, start to have those conversations and get okay saying those words and talking about it.